Thanks for joining me. This lab session is entitled JMeter Configuration. The JMeter bin directory contains several property files that can be reviewed. There are some items in the JMeter IDE that should be considered, and there are test controls to consider each time a new test is developed. The thought process behind JMeter configuration is associated with controls in three areas. The bin directory or folder contains some properties files. The JMeter IDE has some components, and the test controls that are part of executing JMeter scripts are also important for configuration. The settings in the report generator.properties file can be partially or completely copied to the user.properties file and uncommented for use by JMeter. Settings in the user properties file override what is in the JMeter properties file. We will take a closer look during the lab portion of this session. Other properties files may have a need for updates, but for the course, there should be no need to modify any properties. If you encounter a problem with memory insufficient, look at the heap settings in the jmeter.bat file in the bin directory. It may look like the following. Set the number values to no more than 80% of your system memory. Let's talk briefly about the directory, the bin directory that has the properties files. Here is a list of the properties files. There are 6 of them currently, and the most common are the jmeter.properties, user.properties, and system.properties. What tends to happen is the user.properties file is updated by things like the report generator.properties file. Let's go into a little bit more detail about the user.properties file being affected by the report generator.properties file. Let's open the user properties file so you can see what I'm talking about. All right. Here is a sample of the user.properties file, and starting, if I scroll down a little bit, starting with this reporting configuration statement or comment, from that point on through, let's go down to where we stop seeing jmeter.report generator, right here. Up to this point, all of this data was copied from the report generator.properties file. So it has the default settings for JMeter with regards to handling report generating. And that information we take from the report generator.properties file and paste it, copy paste it into the user.properties file in this section that I was talking about, from line 201 back to line, find it again, 57. All of that information comes from the JMeter report generator.properties file. Now, So you can see that some of the settings are not commented, they're actually in use, like this JMeter.reportGenerator.overall granularity is set to 60,000. So there are several of those that are in operation or in use, and you don't have to think hard about what settings do I need to have here. It's set up for you what the defaults need to be. If, as you get better at using it and you see a need for making certain changes, then you can. So far, I have not made changes to this. Just put it in. Once it's installed, move that data from the reportGenerator.properties file to the user.properties file. Now, let's talk a little bit about the JMeter.properties file. That one is in high use, and it also brings in the user properties and the system properties file, and you'll see what I'm talking about there. I'll just do a find for user dot properties. And there it is. So what's happening here for both the user.properties and system.properties files, they're pulled in by the JMeter.properties file. If you want to prevent that, you simply comment out those lines. But that's how they are brought into the process for JMeter. Every time script execution occurs, these files are brought into use. I don't intend to go into a lot of detail about this. I simply want you to be aware of what's happening there with the properties files, and when you need to make changes, this is one of the areas where you may find a need to do changes. But you've got to become more familiar with it. Takes time to become familiar and see a need for changes. So I'll stop at this point on the properties. Okay, let's talk about another area of configuration changes, and that is with regards to the JMeter IDE controls. 3 areas that I'd like to briefly talk about. One has to do with templates, or the use of templates. You can create the templates either, or make use of templates, I should say, either using this icon button or the file pull down templates. Let's talk about that one just briefly. With the templates, you can set up or make use of different combinations of elements that make up a specific template. So these templates are labeled here, such as bin shell sampler, or building a web test plan, or JDBC load test, building an advanced web test plan, and so on. Even recording with think time. And when you want to make use of a template, it's simply select it and merge, and what will happen is, well, I'll go ahead and do one just so you can see how that works. Let's say we want building web test plan. What's going to happen is when I select that, it's going to override this test plan statement, and there will be more statements there or more elements. So I select that. It then gives me a little bit of information. I can go out to a website and see more detail about that particular template, and then I can create it to be utilized in my script. And so it again still starts with a test plan, but it's now given it a different name, and it has added a number of other statements or elements to the composite script. Now, we're going to talk in more detail about this later, so don't get worried about what you see here so far. We will see this enough times and get very familiar with all of these statements, all of these elements. The other things about IDE controls or change configuration is basically with the start, stop, and cleanup buttons. So here we start with the green button. We then stop with the stop button, and we then can clean up any output reporting that's normally with the listeners elements that we'll be talking about. One of the examples would be the view tree. So all this information here can be processed. Here I just stopped. I did an immediate stop. It was running and it was outputting this data. And so now I can use either one of these buttons to clear it. If it's just that one, I can use this button. If there are multiple elements that have output, I can clear it all with this one button. All of the data that was output is now gone. So those are simple controls here that I wanted to point out as part of talking about configuration. You have the ability to start, to stop, and to clean up. We'll talk about that some more later. And then there's the plugins. If I go over to options, down at the bottom I'll see Plugins Manager. Now, we're going to talk about this some more later as well, so be aware that I'm not telling you everything you need to know at this point. But there are many plugins available for JMeter that come from various people, companies, what have you, that have contributed to some of the flexibility in JMeter by adding plugins. And so this plugins manager allows it to be all controlled under one umbrella, so to speak. And here you'll see what's installed already, what's available that's not installed, and the ability to go in and upgrade any of those items that were installed. That's all I want to say about this now, but these are things I consider configurable, part of the configuration of the IDE. The third area I wanted to talk to you about concerning JMeter configuration and configuration changes has to do with testing itself, running JMeter scripts. Right before you're seeing some information about the JMeter bat file. That is the one that actually opens or launches the JMeter GUI process. And notice this little statement here. GUI mode should only be used for creating the test script and of course for debugging the test script itself. But then CLI or command line interface mode must be used for load testing. So there's a statement here encouraging you to always run production or test, load test, stress testing, and so on using the command line interface rather than doing it in the GUI mode. But I mentioned earlier that in the GUI mode, I've run many performance, stress, leak, endurance tests, and so on in the GUI mode, but you have to have a machine that has a large amount of memory. 16 gigabytes or and above is not bad for running some or many performance tests with JMeter in the GUI mode. Now, moving on, I'm more interested in right now in just pointing out some things about configuration. There are a number of different BAT files, if you will, command files that come with JMeter, and this is a list of them, and they tell you what they use it for. So the non-GUI would be things like the JMeter-T command, and you can also go into a server mode process with JMeter when you want to run in a remote situation. And also you have the ability with that to do what's called a shutdown and a stop. Both of them are shut down, but one's graceful and one is immediate. So those are things that can be done when JMeter is in operation, running a performance test. So be aware of those things, and we'll talk more about some of these for sure. The JMeter BAT is an important one to talk about concerning the GUI mode, and the JMeter, just JMeter by itself in a command prompt can be used to run some of these command processes, or CLI processes as they call it. So be aware of these things. And there's one more that I want to mention. I'll have to go back to the IDE to show it to you, and that has to do with the thread group. Let's do that. I'll minimize this and bring up JMeter once more. Bear with me. And it's almost there. I'll slide it over and go to full screen so you can see it better. And when we in the IDE, when we have a script, let's use the template again, and I'm going to select the same one I did before, the web test plan, and there we are. Now I can go to the thread group statement. This is the one here. And again, we're going to talk about this in a lot more detail, but I just want to point out that you have the capability in certain thread groups from the test plan element, right click and add thread groups. And right at the bottom, there are two, one called Setup Thread Group and the other called Teardown Thread Group. And what these are intended to complement the normal thread group, which controls the user's ramp up and the overall test behavior. These two, Setup Thread Group and Teardown Thread Group, are intended to run before the actual test and after the actual test. So the setup is intended to do things like maybe create some users dynamically, so you'd have a setup thread group that would manage that, and the ramp up of users and creation of users using the application to create some data. And on the backside, the teardown side or the shutdown side, you might have a group of users that go into the application and clear out data that was created by the real test. So it's a way of creating an environment and replenishing an environment, if you will. If you deleted a lot of data, put the data back out. Or if you added a lot of data, delete the data out. Those kinds of activities can be done with the setup thread group and teardown thread group. Hopefully that's enough for right now for you to have an understanding about that type of configuration. My time has ended for this session. I thank you for yours. Join me in the next video.